Frau Bundeskanzlerin Dr. Merkel, schön Sie wieder dabei zu haben, Frau Bundeskanzlerin. Normalerweise würden wir uns
Normally we would meet in Davos, this time only virtually, but I do remember that last time you were in Davos, we were talking about how we can shape this world more inclusively, more sustainably. And obviously these two issues have gained even more of a priority due to the pandemic. And I think in the meantime, one can safely say that due to the virus, there is an increased necessity to strengthen the resilience of our economic and social systems. I would say that you have been able to guide Germany, Europe, the world, with a steady helm at the rudder. You have shown far-sightedness. You have steered this ship through the unruly waters of recent months. And obviously, we're looking ahead to your address, to your assessment of the present situation. Allow me to add, one of the goals of this meeting, of this virtual meeting, is to rebuild trust into our ability to shape the future. And part and parcel of this is obviously also international cooperation as one of the preconditions for doing just that. Madam Chancellor, a very warm welcome to you, and we're very much looking forward to your address. Thank you, Professor Schwab, and thank you, ladies and gentlemen, all of you at your screens. COVID-19 has changed the world, and that is also illustrated by this year's Davos format, which is a virtual one. In May, there is to be a physical meeting, but not in Davos, this time in Singapore. And I just, in my preliminary remarks to Professor Schwab, I said, I hope he's not going to swap the beautiful mountains of Davos for the duration with the skyscrapers of Singapore, although that is obviously a vibrant place in this world. Today, a year ago, I think no one would have thought that we live a pandemic this year, but some actually were sort of far-sighted enough. Mr. Shaheen, the head of BioNTech, was one of them who said that he decided in the year before that to actually change the format of the whole research program and develop an RNA vaccine against this virus. And what he contributed and many others contributed to enabling us to now have a vaccine only 12 months after, well, it shows that humankind is capable of such great scientific feats, is capable of doing groundbreaking research. And I think this shows the way out of this pandemic, although this is going to be a very arduous road, much of an uphill battle, much more difficult than many think. BioNTech, Pfizer, other companies all over the world have developed vaccines. BioNTech, as you probably know, was a startup. 60 people from 60 different nations work in this startup. So it's a clear illustration also of the sheer value of international cooperation and of what you can actually do with this kind of cooperation. The pandemic has left deep imprints on our societies and our economies, and it is safe to say, I think, that it's going to determine in many ways the way we live, the way we do business over the next 2 years. Hundreds of people, hundreds of millions of people have actually become infected. Millions have died. There is certainly also, there are certainly only the official figures. And in many ways, Davos is the right place to discuss how we can get out of this pandemic and how we can forge a future-looking path. Anything that contains this pandemic is obviously a good thing. It's not only good for the health of the people, it's good for the economic, for the social possibilities, for the cultural possibilities. You chose as a motto the Great Reset as this year's motto. I think do we really need this great reset? That would be the question that I ask as a first instance. Or is it not so that perhaps we need less in the goals we set for ourselves, a reset, but more in the resolve that we show in anything we do? So there are three questions that I think are important at this point in time, and what this pandemic has really driven home to us. First, it has showed us very clearly how much we are interlinked, how we are globally interdependent. If we think of the origins of this virus in Wuhan, in China, and how it has spread over the whole globe, I think it was very clear to see what globalization actually also means, not as regards actions of humankind, but that we all live in one planet, and that in such an existential crisis, trying to shut yourself off from others, trying to isolate yourself, fails. At least with this virus, it has clearly failed. And secondly, our vulnerability has become obvious. Somehow, this virus was transmitted from animals to human beings, which has shown us yet again that we are part of our natural habitat, of our natural environment. And although we have a lot of knowledge, technological knowledge and other knowledge, we still depend on nature. That has something that is in a way very calming, very soothing, but it has its consequences. Thirdly, as regards Germany, let me say very clearly that this pandemic is something, well, like a natural disaster that only appears once in a century. And in many ways, it has tested the resilience of our systems, of our societies. It has shown our flaws, our weaknesses in our social systems. Our strengths also have become apparent, but we want to address primarily those weaknesses, those flaws. Maybe we should start with what Germany has learned, what are our weaknesses, what are our strengths. I can say that there is something that we could rely on, and that was the fact that so many people stepped up to the plate, that they showed a sense of community. That is our biggest treasure. And in spite of all of the difficulties that you have when you have a federal makeup of a state, it has also its advantages, because it brings responsibility to a lower level. We have also seen that Germany is part and parcel of Europe. We have all, in the beginning of the crisis, made mistakes, because we were sort of inward looking, shutting ourselves off against each other, but very quickly we learned the lesson. Now, speed is a problem. We have seen that our processes have become very bureaucratic, that they take too long. And that is something that we need to address. There's one good thing, a foundation that has stood us in good stead, namely our solid and sound finances. So we were able actually to help our companies, to help our citizens resolutely introduce short-time work, keep the economy going, launch more than 100 billion strong economic impetus program, all of that has strengthened our resilience. There are flaws also, weaknesses, a lack of digitalization of our society, which starts with the super-regional networking of our national health services, of our local health services, shows digitalization of our education system, for example. Online teaching, online learning is unfortunately too weak. So this is where we said we have to step in with our economic impetus program, with our economic growth program, and address that. We also saw that a resilient health system is important. And in Germany, we have a very good individual healthcare system, but community health, for example, prevention, preventive medicine, here we do not as yet have sufficient resilience inbuilt in our system. So that too is something that we need to learn from this pandemic. We feel confirmed in our research policy. Ever since I have come to office, we have steadily increased our expenditure for research and development. The 3% share in GDP have now been exceeded. We would like to approach the 5.8, and everything we see with vaccines and also with other technologies is that promoting a very strong research and development policy is certainly the right thing. Now, a big question is to be discussed, needs to be debated. The word sovereignty is something that seems to be on everyone's lips. Many of the supply chains have been interrupted. They have not really proved their resilience. So what we have to ask ourselves is that indeed a weakness? The fact that we depend so much on global supply chains, or should we rather render the supply chains so resilient, so strong that they actually also tolerate that sort of strain in times of pandemic? And I think we have to prevent people resorting to an inward-looking policy again, but that's something that we need to be honest about. We need to honestly debate this, but supply chains have to be rendered more stable, more resilient, if in such a time of crisis you want to depend on them. Now, vulnerability is something that I mentioned earlier on. This vulnerability came to the fore when the supply chains were interrupted. But after all, this is a virus, let me remind you, that moved from an animal to a human being. All of our conventions on sustainability, be it the Biodiversity Convention, be it the Climate Convention that is enshrined in the Paris Agreement, are absolutely to the point on this. And we need to work much more to bring them to bear, we need to show much more resolve to implement them. So this is, in a way, ample proof. This year, we will have incoming in China the biodiversity conference. And also, when we implement the Paris Agreement, we can prove that we have learned our lessons. And the European Union has, as a first step, showed that it has learned its lesson. We have said our European goal, our national goal for CO2 emissions from 40% to 55 is something that we want to aim at for 2030. We have committed ourselves for 2050 to climate neutrality, which may well lead to a situation that Europe, and once we have achieved that, is the first climate neutral continent. And before us, and I assume that the Commission President has addressed that issue as well, we have very hard months ahead of us, because we have to now find a form how to reach that goal of a 55% reduction in the new Green Deal. We have already changed 40% of our energy generation to renewables, but we also know that it's demanding tremendous efforts if this vulnerability due to climate change is to be overcome. One has to resort to very tough political measures, and we have to obviously take people along, for example, phasing out coal, changing over to hydrogen, a complete change as regards mobility, moving over to electric mobility, and we have to be open, and also hydrogen maybe. We have to be open-minded as regards our technology. The European Union, in all of its efforts for a recovery, we have taken a very unusual step for European Union standards. We have said in this recovery plan that we don't want to do business as usual. We really want to set priorities, very clear priorities. More than 35% of all of the funds used need to serve climate protection, more than 20% digitalization. So that is future-looking, forward-looking investment, because we want to have more resilience, more sustainability. And there's something that the world has, after all, achieved over the past few decades, namely the Sustainable Development Goals for 2030. That is indeed something that in a very comprehensive way shows the way ahead. How do we need to act if we don't want to be as vulnerable as we currently are? But the summit meeting of the United Nations last year also showed very clearly that we lag far behind expectations. And this is a clear and present danger, that after this pandemic, we all become more inward-looking. We industrialized countries concentrate on our own policies, and we are not caring for developing countries. That's something that we must avoid at all costs. That's why the German goal, the German objective is, and this also as regards the recovery program, the European Union recovery program, we must not actually reduce our expenditure in our cooperation with the developing countries, but rather do more. Now, the third step is digitalization in the sense of the dependencies that we have all over the planet. And that is something that actually was very much something that we needed to contend with. And it's become very clear to me, even more clear, I should say, that we ought to choose, that we need to choose a multilateral approach, that shutting ourselves off against others will not help us to solve our problems. We see this first and foremost on the vaccination front, because that obviously is how we get out of this pandemic. That clearly also shows whether our acts match our deeds. The G20, I think, have done a tremendously good thing under the Saudi presidency in committing themselves to a multilateral approach as regards vaccination. Later on, and subsequent to that, COVAX was founded. Here, the wealthier countries need to pay into this fund. That is right. The EU is doing that, is participating. Germany is participating. Financial means, funds are one thing, but in these times of scarcity, obviously, the fact whether one actually has a vaccine is also of the essence. And this is all about fair distribution, not only about money. And this is why I am so pleased that now Gavi is leading the negotiations for COVAX, was able to conclude first contracts in this respect, also with those companies, for example, that have received their authorization through EMA. I'm very pleased that the World Bank is supporting this very intensively, and we will try to do everything we can in order to see to it that distribution can be launched as quickly as possible. But we should not delude ourselves. The question who receives what kind of vaccination, how quickly, all over the planet, will again create a new narrative, if you like. Because when you receive in such an hour of need help, you will remember that for much, much longer than help that has been extended to you in good times. Now, this is the hour of multilateralism. What does multilateralism mean? Multilateralism does not only mean somehow working together, muddling through, but it means showing transparency. And we have to be honest, at the beginning of the pandemic, we have probably not been as transparent as we ought to have been as regards, for example, the information released by China as to the origins of this virus, and also as regards information policy of WHO. But that does not mean that we ought to sort of simply look back, but we ought to look ahead. We ought to draw the conclusions from it. There is a WHO team, after all, now in China. They will come up with a report. We ought to strengthen WHO. So it's a very good message that the United States of America, after the transition now, after Joe Biden has become president of the United States, have declared that they wish to be participating in the work of the WHO. That's a very important start. Now, global links, global commitments mean that we have to have an interest in how the rest of the world is faring. So development cooperation is in our national interest. That's how we see it in Germany. We want to strengthen the links with Africa. We want to strengthen investments in Africa. We, as you remember, have launched within our G20 presidency the Compact with Africa. It's supported by the IMF, by the World Bank, and we're going to be participating in this in the future as well. Now, fair international trade. That obviously is a wide open field. WTO, as we know, is working for open structures. There has been a standstill over the past few months. Right now, the arbitration panel, unfortunately, has not been set up, so WTO cannot really act. And I, as you know, am a great champion of bilateral action, bilateral relations, but still I think that WTO is absolutely of the essence if we really want to be sincere about multilateralism. And we see a number of bilateral trade agreements, multilateral trade agreements in the on the Asian continent. We see RCP, that is very remarkable. Countries of very different structures are linked by this instrument. During the German presidency, we have made one step further. We have gone one step further in as regards the EU-China investment agreement that has been negotiated ever since 2013. We have tried to put down a marker to come to an agreement there. Why am I so satisfied that we've been able to make this step? Well, because I think that this, in a way, has injected a new quality in the relationship between the European Union and China, because we can do more now. That is more in line with reciprocity, more transparency, for example, as regards subsidies, particularly as regards state-owned companies. But it also opens up a more predictable access to high technology areas, state-of-the-art technology, that is. And it also has a lot to do with standards of labor, of particularly along the lines of ILO. If we want to have multilateral organizations, if we want to have multilateral conventions and agreements, certain standards have to be put down, common standards as regards the conditions of work, as regards the environmental norms. And this is why these core norms of the ILO is of prime importance. And that too is part and parcel of this agreement. We have to be very, very fast in finding multilateral answers to new challenges of digitalization. And I do hope that particularly with the new American administration, we will be able to continue the work of OECD, particularly as regards taxation at the very least of digital companies, that we are also better in a better position to look at the global importance of competition laws in order to prevent global monopolies, because we do have these tendencies all over the world. And we need to address that. If we don't do it, we will, if we go it alone, do it insufficiently, because going it alone will not suffice to address those monopolies. Now, we hope that an economic recovery will happen all over the world. We now have regions where there is economic growth. Europe has been rather hard hit, but this year we have predictions as to more growth, but obviously this has to happen in a more concerted way all over the world. And for that, coordinated measures are necessary. I see that G20 and the Italian presidency has a central role to play, and I know that Italy is working in this direction. So to sum it up, if we look at what the pandemic has left us with, I would say that in many ways it serves as a confirmation of what in many ways was the spirit of Davos over those past years. The questions that you addressed were the right ones, but as Erich Kästner, a German writer, used to say, nothing good happens unless you do it. And the pandemic has made it very clear, I think, to all of us that discussing, debating, intellectual exchange is important, but the pandemic has also shown very clearly that now is the time for action. Now is the time where we ought to act together, or to abide by the same principles that obviously we need to discuss and agree on previously, but that we need to do something to address those weaknesses and overcome them. That's it by way of my remarks. Thank you for your attention. Thank you very much, Madam Chancellor, allowing me, if I may, to take you up on this last point. One of the consequences of this pandemic is, as far as we can say, that companies are much more aware now of their social responsibility, their responsibility for society. So we have not less partners, we even have more partners than at the beginning of this pandemic, particularly because these companies work in our working groups, in a number of our working groups, because they want to do what you said, match their words with deeds. Just one example, we have a number of working groups, meetings here during this virtual annual conference. One small example, the commitment to set up a platform, for example, to plant 1 million new trees in the course of this decade. And reskilling and upskilling, also the further training of people, further education of people, that is something that we need abilities that are far different than the sort of skills that we used to have. There's one moment left to us. I would like to come back to 2 or 3 issues that you addressed. You were speaking about the vulnerability that we all felt. We have to render our societies more resilient, which means that effort needs to transcend the current crisis situation. We have showed in our report how many risks we need to contend with in the world at large. And maybe it might be of interest to hear from you how you see this. Dr. von der Leyen this morning said that there were certain efforts that were made at the European level, particularly in the health sector, that are now building resilience, not only against COVID-19, but also against future risks. What's your take on this? How do you see this, particularly as a scientist? I think our economy, or the way we do business in general, in good times, has a certain tendency to actually try and use all the leeway that we have, all the wriggle room that we have. Efficiency is sort of number one, but then you have no buffer zone, as it were. We have just-in-time delivery, so there's no real buffer inbuilt in the system. You start from the assumption that everything works just fine, 100%. You can see this when you have, for example, airplanes that have to stay on the ground simply because all of a sudden there is a bad weather front. And the more the world is connected, the more a disturbance in one part of the system leads to a ripple effect throughout the system. And then we see how a linear event can change into a non-linear event. And that is something that I think we ought to learn, that in good times, we also have to have something up our sleeves that we can then use, the necessary funds, for example, or the necessary beds in our ICUs, or the necessary drug stocks, medicinal drugs, that we have the necessary personnel. Good armies know that they need to draft reservists in the case of war. So I think it would be a good thing if all of these really elementary functions of our societies, the underpinnings of our societies, if we screen them very carefully and try to analyze where we need more of a buffer, as it were. And I think, for example, in climate change, we're already in this phase of mitigation. So we have to adapt to risks before we can actually come to change. So that's in a way the lesson from this pandemic, that we need to be very careful not to assume that everything will always work just fine, will always be perfect, but that we have to also, contend with certain problems.
So in a way, what we need is a precautionary activity and agility. Yes, in a way, you're bringing together 2 magic terms. We've been quoting more than once in the context of the corona infection numbers that there is no glory in prevention. Now, when you take a look at the course that infection rates have taken, and we have all been closely observing developments in that regard of late, the phenomenon of exponential growth means that there's little you can see at the beginning, but you have to take action exactly during that period. That, I believe, is the major lesson we have to draw from the pandemic. And we should also apply that lesson to other areas if you want to ensure that the world does not end up in a shape that makes it difficult for us to control developments. So even in extremely difficult situations, we would be able to act in a wise manner if we were to pursue such a precautionary approach. We would be prepared for some unexpected situations. We are quite aware of us not being able to solve everything at one time. We have to pursue a step-by-step approach, trying out things, seeing whether we can control this phenomenon that is so difficult to control. As far as that is concerned, I support this concept of precautionary agility. Madam Chancellor, one of the consequences of this crisis, or rather of this pandemic, is the enhanced role that the government has to play. And as was mentioned earlier, the enhanced role to be played by leading companies. And they have realized that they have to act in a spirit that protects the environment, that thinks of social needs of people. Now, what does that mean for our long-term social model and for our long-term business model? I'm asking you this question because you know that I have been very committed to this principle of stakeholder capitalism, and I've been surprised time again that this seems to be triggering some resistance of a psychological nature. I believe that companies are not only an economic unit, but they also have a social function to play, and I don't think that those two contradict each other. But how do you what is your future social model that, as you see it, we should strive for? And perhaps a second question added up to this one that results from this first question. The leading companies of the world will emerge from this crisis stronger than before, whereas the medium and smaller sized companies are especially hard hit. And these are the companies that are of great importance for Europe at large, but especially for Germany, because they have a very important social role to play. Well, I would say that we do have small companies and we have big companies that have benefited to some extent from the crisis because other things are in demand now. Demand for digital solutions is exploding, so to speak, whereas other companies are especially hard hit. When you think of restaurants, when you think of event managers, when you think of artists and their work, when you think of smaller shops and department stores, once the pandemic has been overcome, we will be able to ease restrictions, and we will have to then take a closer look at what we can do in order to maintain a certain infrastructure. I think that there are groups and companies that have benefited from this crisis in an unexpected manner, but you may be a big company and nevertheless be hard hit by the consequences of the pandemic. The question you put to me was of a very fundamental nature, and I think it is nigh impossible to respond to it to this question in 5 minutes' time. What has become obvious time and again is that what we call the social market economic model is a good model. It puts the man in its center. We have to think things from the perspective of man, from human beings. We have to use and exploit fully the inventiveness and the imagination of men and women, but at the same time we have to set certain rules and provide guidelines. And I think we have to rethink these in times of digital sovereignty of each and every individual. Whereas the basic approach is always the same, and it is not static in nature. It is that we have to strike the right balance between the actions of the state, of the government, and allow the individual to realize itself while providing the long-term framework conditions. So on the one hand, we have processes of concentration that have to be stopped if they become too powerful. That is the competition law, which makes it so important. in times of globalization, when you pursue a nationally based policy, you always have to think of the global interconnections. You have to internalize prices. Climate protection being one case in point. I believe the best instrument here is still putting a price on CO2 emissions. I think that's the most effective instrument, but they have to be internalized. You have to make that mandatory, because I don't think any individual company would do it on itself or not quickly enough, and not the totality of companies. And now when you take a look at the last 15 years or so, I would say that in 2007, 2008, when we were facing the major financial crisis, we had a trend in the direction of too much freedom, not enough rules with regard to the efficiency of financial markets and of capital markets. Then, in the wake of the crisis, we had the opposite, excessive development, too much regulation. We went down that road together. The internalization of what is so important for us in our lives, economy, ecology, the price on emissions, makes the actions of the state so important. We cannot rely solely on the companies acting in a way that will be to the best of the world. However, we have to be careful as not to allow the pendulum to swing too much in the other direction, where the state feels that he is the best entrepreneur, because that would put a damper on the imagination, the creativeness of our human element. So it is a perpetual search. You'll have to strike a balance. You have to identify what is the optimal approach. You can no longer think along as national lines as you used to do in the past. So that is the way in which I would describe this. I think social market economy and stakeholder capitalism are basically identical. A last question, if I may. You stressed the importance of multilateralism. Yesterday, President Xi Jinping spoke to us, and he warned us against the involvement of blocs, and he too focused on multilateralism and underlined its importance. Do you think that we can hope for a renaissance of multilateral cooperation, given the trends that we have been observing of late? Also, in the context of bringing back home supply chains, can we prevent the involvement of blocs? Perhaps I may respond first to the issue, the question you put with regard to multilateralism. The Chinese president spoke yesterday, and he and I agree on that. We see a need for multilateralism. But there's one question where we are not in immediate agreement, will probably be the question of what it means when you have different social models. To what extent, when does interference begin? Where does it begin and where does it end? When do you stand up for elementary values that are indivisible? The President of China has committed itself to the Charter of the United Nations, and the dignity of the individual plays a part in that charter. So, and we have to discuss this issue, no matter what social system we come from, and you end up quickly with different interpretations of what the meaning of multilateralism is. It doesn't necessarily or simply mean the coexistence of entities that seem lifeless, but we're talking societies here that consist of human beings. And thus, we also need to engage and exchange views on these different social models. Transparency is the second important element of multilateralism. And I mentioned that earlier. Transparency about what is happening within a country, so as to allow you to assess whether things are still, trade is happening on the basis of a rules-based system, or whether you are playing out certain advantages against another country. And of course, this leads to tension areas, and you can discuss these also in opposition to each other. I would very much wish to avoid the building of blocks, I don't think it would do justice to many societies if we were to say this is the United States and over there is China, and we're grouping around either the one or the other. This is not my understanding of how things ought to be. I think we will have more values that we share, more positions that we hold in common, but there will also be differences of opinion and different interests. I'm not in favor of a total decoupling of all digital activities. We should not strive for that because it would feed into a division of the world. But as you said, each and every one of us has to identify the vital and elementary life functions of one's society. And the pandemic has taught us a lesson here. Even if my multilateral partner leaves me for a certain point in time, I can nevertheless do what is of elementary importance for my society. We have open societies. I'm not thinking China in particular when I say that the United States, for example, have a war act that is in force with regard to the import and export of vaccines. This also affects important components that go into the production of vaccines. Of course, this is undoubtedly going to feed into this original reflex here in Germany. If there's something you lack, that you need to produce your vaccine, you will make sure in future that you can produce it back at home. Madam Chancellor, in a way, one could say that Europe has a special part to play in this regard. Perhaps I may coin a phrase or a word, as far as the stress on multilateralism is concerned. Thank you very much, Madam Chancellor. We very much hope to see you perhaps later this year in Singapore, the physical meeting, or then next year in Davos. Thank you very much for your time. As I address myself now to the participants of this meeting, the Chancellor will have a somewhat private discussion afterwards. You will have to perhaps